What's up, gangsters? It's a fine fall afternoon out here at Rube Goldberg Enterprises, and I feel like doing a video. I'm kind of at that switchover point between a couple of projects where I've decided to stop working on one and move over to another one, and so my workbench is nice and clean, just the way I like it. And I thought this would be a good time to add a video to my collection. If any of you guys have watched my nonsense much, you know that in some of my experiments and my video build blogs, whatever you want to call them, I've talked a lot about decal application and kind of, mentioned at least in passing what my decal strategy is or tactics, just kind of how I approach the things. But I've never done a video specifically about how to apply decals. And I thought that would be a good thing to have in my model making fundamentals set. And so that's what I'm going to do. Now, I'm going to issue the same disclaimer at the beginning of this as I have with all of my other how-to videos, which is I don't consider this the gospel. I don't think that this makes me some kind of an expert. I'm going to tell you what I think and the way that I do it and why I do it that way. And, I guess the results speak for themselves. I don't have a lot of decal problems. So does that mean that the way I do it is perfect? No, but it has been successful. And I think anybody can do what I do and have the same kind of success. And I think that's important because decals are a weird thing. They, haven't really changed a whole lot. I mean, yeah, maybe the quality of decals is a little bit better than it was 40 years ago. Maybe the ink is a little bit thinner. Maybe the carrier film is a little bit better or softer or whatever. I could see where printing could be improved over what it was. But honestly, when I think back to my first go-round at building models, when I was just a lad, and this would have been, 35 years ago, decal application went the same for me when I was 13 as it does for me now. I had a bottle of Solvacet. I put vinegar in my decal water, just like I read in a model making book, and I don't recall having a lot of frustrations with decals. Of course, just like we say in motorcycle racing, the older I get, the faster I was. So maybe I had a lot more problems with decals back then than I remember. But I'm still doing it basically the same way. And I'm always just sort of flabbergasted at the level of fear that people have with decals. I know a lot of dudes just absolutely hate them. And I've never really understood that. To me, they seem pretty straightforward. Yeah, it can get tedious, especially if you're doing some kind of a modern jet that's got 100 stencils on it. But being tedious is different than being difficult. And I just never have found decals to be a difficult thing. Yeah, sometimes they'll be uncooperative on an uneven surface where you've got to wrap them around a curve or something like that. But again, that's different from the thing itself being a difficult skill, because I don't think that decaling itself is. I think, as I will show, that you use the same basic methodology all the time, and that you might make some little adjustments along the way, but essentially it's the same process all the time. But because of that fear, I guess, or because of the kinds of mythology that get perpetrated on model making forums and Facebook groups, there are all kinds of gyrations that people go through with putting decals on. I mean, sometimes it's like, dudes be like, okay, my method for doing decals for the last 50 years that's won me umpty-11 IPMS awards and been published in various magazines is first I set out my bottle of microsol and microset exactly 6 inches apart on my workbench, and I heat my decal water to exactly 147.5 degrees, and I put on a little Mozart turned up to exactly volume level 9. I mean, look, you get the point, right? It just seems like that, for whatever reason, that a lot of guys just vastly overcomplicate the process. I mean, I watched a video this morning where a guy was applying a relatively large decal, about that big, and he was espousing the method of floating the decal on with future, which just saying it out loud to me feels wrong. But basically what he did is he slathered the surface of the model with future using a brush, then laid the decal on top of it, and all the while claiming that this, I guess, was supposed to help him move the decal around and get it more easily positioned, and then more thoroughly suck the decal back or down into all of the panel lines and various details. And while he was doing the video, he actually ruined one of the decals and had to start over, which was kind of funny, I guess. I mean, I feel bad for him, don't get me wrong. Then, while he was doing it, and the future was still wet, he said, oh, you know what, I think I'm going to apply some Solvaset just to make sure that the decal is soft enough for the future to do its thing. And I was just, at that point, my head was spinning. So, at any rate, hopefully it's obvious why that all seems pretty crazy. But just in case it's not, you know, Solvaset is a decal setting agent that is supposed to soften the decal and make it... Anyway, I'm going to talk about all that here in a second. I'm going to flip the camera view and show you kind of what I have set up here. I'm going to do basically a basic decal application that is exactly the way I always do it. And I've already talked for more time than that really should take. But I also want to do some experimenting on camera so that I can hopefully dispel a few widely held myths about decals. So, with all of that jaw flapping, let's get after it. Let's see what's up. Okay, so to start with, let's talk about the things that I use to apply decals. My list of materials is pretty simple. I mean, obviously, you need scissors and hobby knives and whatever to cut your decals out. I'm not going to dwell on that. The main thing is you need some water, and I have right here, you can see a obviously fairly cloudy and well-used jar of what I call decal water. It's special only for the reason that it has microset added to it. Why microset in my decal water? I remember a long time ago reading in a model making book that if you added vinegar to your decal water, that it helped make the process go easier. Now, why exactly it does that is still a mystery. Is it because it somehow does a better job of softening the adhesive on decals, which as I understand it is basically cornstarch? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. Is it because it somehow changes the surface tension and allows the water to more thoroughly wet the surface that you're applying the decal to? Maybe, maybe not, I don't know. But it does seem to help things slide around a little more easily, so I still do it. Don't have any proof that it actually makes much difference, though. Now, some of you are immediately saying, oh no, you can't do that, your decal water is not hot. Okay, let's talk about that. There is a widely held belief that decals go on better if you use warm water. Now, I did a test in one of my videos last year, I think, where I tested some Tamiya decals, and I did them using both hot water and room temperature water. And what I found is that the decal may conform a little better to the surface initially if you use hot water, which is great, no big deal, that's awesome. But that it's still not good enough that you can avoid having to use a setting solution. And so my opinion is, why do I need to bother heating my water up if it's not ultimately going to make any difference? It's kind of a belt and suspenders thing as far as I'm concerned. The setting solution is what's going to do the real work of making the decal settle into the details of the surface. So I'm not going to bother with heating up my water. Now, again, there are decals that are thicker and stiffer, and working over a curved surface is different than working over a relatively flat surface like this airplane wing. So heating the water may help a little bit. The bottom line is, if it makes you feel better about the process, by all means, go ahead, do it. I'm not going to say that heating your decal water is wrong. I'm simply going to say that I don't believe it's an absolute necessity or that it necessarily produces better results. So that's my decal water. How much micro set do I have in there? I don't know. It's like 10% maybe. And when I dump this out, as I clearly need to do, I don't have a new bottle of micro set on hand, so I'm going to just use vinegar, and I'm going to do it at about the same ratio. Now, I mentioned setting solutions. Now, this is a thing that gets really confusing for a lot of people. And I blame micro scale industries for this, because forever, I mean, even back in the day, they had these two products, Micro Sol and Micro Set. I don't have the bottle of Micro Set here, but I'm sure most of you know that it has a blue label on it. And it's kind of weird because now we tend to call decal setting solutions like this from Solvaset a setting solution. And so people would think naturally that Micro Set is a setting solution and Micro Sol is something else. Well, it's not. I view a setting solution as one that basically melts the decal into the surface that it's being applied to. And I base that on the fact that that's essentially what Solvaset does. So for me, these are named backwards, and it creates a lot of confusion. But if you're going to use Micro Set and Micro Sol, the only thing you really have to remember is blue before red. Use the stuff in the blue bottle before you use the stuff in the red bottle. And if you're going to use the stuff in the blue bottle straight out of it, then what a lot of guys will do is just brush some of it on the surface that they're applying the decal to and use it as kind of a wetting agent, as opposed to what I do, which is actually adding it to the decal water itself. Whatever it is, that's the order that it should be used in. Micro Sol or Solvaset or any other setting agent is different in that these are made out of alcohols. And you can see that right here on the front of Solvaset. Contains methoxy-2-propanol, methoxy-1-propanol. Those are alcohols, okay? And what they are meant to do is basically act as a solvent, Solvaset, Micro Sol, on the decal film. What you have to think of or have to remember is that a decal is basically just a few layers of a lacquer type ink or paint or whatever you want to call it on a clear carrier film. And so just like any other lacquer type paint, you can dissolve it with a strong enough solvent. And so and one of the main components of a lot of lacquer thinners are these types of alcohols. So these are just really weak solutions that are just strong enough to actually soften the ink. Now, what I have found, and what I think most people have found, is that Micro Sol is a good enough solution for a lot of decals. Decals obviously come in various thicknesses. Tamiya decals tend to be as thick as linoleum. Cartograph decals, and it's important to note that some Tamiya decals, particularly in their car kits and their motorcycle kits, are made by Cartograph, but Cartograph decals tend to be very thin. And Micro Sol is often enough of a setting solution for those. If you really need the hammer, though, Solvaset is fantastic. I have run into decals that would not submit with one application of Solvaset, but they are few and far between. And what you can do in that situation is going to be this a topic here in just a second. But the bottom line is that a setting solution is nothing more than a mild solvent that softens the decal film enough to allow it to settle and to allow any air that's trapped underneath it to permeate through the surface. And remember that, because that's going to be kind of an important point here in a little bit. So anyway, those are my decal application materials. Now the test today is going to be like this. The first thing I'm going to do is, you can see I've got this sheet from Tamiya's 132nd Mustang. I already know these decals are pretty thick. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to cut one of these yellow ones off, and I'm going to apply it on this wing just as I normally do. Now, the important thing to note about this test mule right here is this is GASP flat paint, okay? That is Flatty McFlatterson right there. No gloss whatsoever. You can see the level of surface finish. It's about as smooth as gloss, as flat paint is ever going to be. I don't know, I don't remember what's on here. I did some weathering tests on this and then sprayed a flat coat on it, and if I remember right, it's dull coat, which is a lacquer, but honestly I can't remember. At any rate, point being is, I am about to do what a lot of people claim is absolute sacrilege, and that is to apply a decal directly onto a matte surface. And it would be directly on the paint if it weren't for the fact that there was a flat coat on here. I normally do not do any kind of clear coating before I put my decals on, at least not for that reason. There are lots of people who are going to try and convince you that you absolutely must put a gloss coat down before you do your decals. I mean, it's such a strong point of dogma in the hobby that you see people get in, knocked down, drag out brawls about it on the internet, and it just gets silly. And I just don't believe in it. I've never felt the need to do it, and I have no proof that, and I don't think anybody really does have much proof that using a gloss layer before you decal actually is of much benefit. But let's talk about it for a second. Why do people say that you need to have a gloss surface? So the old wives' tale is that the reason you get silvering, which is that annoying phenomenon where there's little splotches in the decal that have a different reflectivity than the film around it, and it sticks out like a sore thumb. The theory is that happens because you get air trapped underneath the decal. Now, that very well may be true, but here's the point of contention, is why does that happen? People argue that the tiny little pores in the surface of this flat paint is what is trapping all of the nefarious air molecules that make your decal silver. But what's always baffled me is why we're going to say that those little microscopic pores are the root of all evil, but this panel line right here, or these rivets over here, or the ridges in the zimmerit on a Tiger tank are not too rough for the decal. I mean, think about that for a second. If I take this surface and I spray a gloss layer over it, unless it's so thick that it completely obliterates all of this detail, then what do I have? I still have bumps and rivets and grooves and lines. It's just that now they're shiny. So again, I'm not clear on the logic of why a gloss coat is suddenly going to make any possibility of trapped air reduced. But we're going to put it to the test, because right here I have another test mule that I have sprayed a liberal layer of aqua gloss on. Okay, you can see that. I think that is about as glossy as anybody is going to ever expect an aircraft wing to be. as part of their decaling process. And at that, it took 3 layers of aqua gloss to get it that smooth. Aqua gloss is not bad. I would never use it really as a final gloss for something that was going to have an automotive finish, for example. But that's not too bad. I mean, that's obviously a lot slipperier than the flat paint is down here. Why 3 layers? Well, that's just what it took before I felt comfortable that it was going to be undoubtedly glossy. And beyond 3 layers, I've found with aqua gloss is kind of gets into diminishing returns. You can keep spraying, but you don't get a whole lot. The finish doesn't get a whole lot slicker. So we are going to test, because I'm going to put the same decals that I put on this one over here, and we're going to see if it makes any difference as far as the quality of the application. And the decals that I'm going to use are what I think are kind of the worst case. Okay, these are Tamiya decals. And again, people are going to say, oh, Tamiya decals are terrible. But the reason that I'm going to use these is because these crosses obviously have carrier film throughout the entire middle of them. And carrier film that's just clear like that is where silvering is obviously going to show up the worst. So I'm going to apply one of these over here on this flat surface and one of them over here on this gloss surface, and we're going to see if there's really any difference. Now, to really up the ante of the test, I'm going to also use some of these decals. Now, these I discovered kind of by accident not too long ago that these are quite possibly the worst decals I've ever encountered. I mean, they're definitely the worst I've ever encountered. I don't know how they could get any worse. These are from the Accurate Miniatures Now Academy B25 Mitchell. And I discovered how bad these were when I was doing this test panel for my K-Colors test. And I just chopped them out, threw them on here, and they were immediate. I mean, I could immediately tell they were going to be a problem because they were very curly, and even after a liberal application of Solvacet, there was obviously going to be a lot of silvering. And the edges even of this one in particular wouldn't settle down. They were curly and just ratty looking, and I mean, it was a mess. And so, in the following the theory of using a mild solvent to soften the decal and get it to lay down, I started kind of working my way up through a progression of things that I thought might help. So after Solvacet didn't do it, and I mean I applied Solvacet 3 or 4 times, very liberally, like just had a big puddle of it sitting there for a long time. Didn't have any effect whatsoever. Didn't even begin to wrinkle these decals. So I upped the ante and used some X20A, which is about half alcohols and half water. But people have talked about using X20A as a decal setting solution, and I expect it to be a little stronger than Solvacet, so I thought maybe this will work. Nothing. Didn't even budge. So I said, okay, I'll see your X20A resistance, and I'll raise you some Tamiya lacquer thinner. Now again, lacquer thinners are blends of alcohols and other things like methylethyl ketone, acetone, butyl acetate, all kinds of stuff. And they come in various strengths. And Tamiya lacquer thinner is a relatively weak lacquer thinner. So I thought I could do this, and it shouldn't, disrupt the paint that's here as long as I don't rub on anything. Because of this test, I was putting the decal directly on the K-Colors paint to see what would happen. Once again, basically no effect whatsoever. And I did it several times. So I said, fine. I don't have anything to lose. This is just a test. And I used straight hardware store lacquer thinner out of my airbrush cleaning bottle right on top of these decals. And that's what it took to finally get them to start to melt down into the surface. But even at that, it took 3 or 4 tries, and several rounds of popping bubbles with a riveting wheel and scoring them with my hobby knife. You can see in the middle of the star there where I had to slice it to get it to lay down, and some of those blotches that are there that are not from the weathering that I was doing are actually bubbles that just never completely stuck to the surface. And even after all of that, when it was finally dry, it still had a kind of a wrinkly surface to it. And so then I did what you can do with any decal when you want to try and hide the edges of the carrier film. I sprayed a liberal amount of aqua gloss around it and a little bit over the top of it. And the idea there is basically to build the surrounding area up to where it's as tall as the top of the decal. You let that cure out for a day or so, and then come back and wet sand that down to where it's all level. And then when you come back and go over it with a matte coat, or another gloss coat, whatever the case may be, then you'll see, as I have here, that the edges of the film will pretty much completely disappear. This one's not perfect. I could have worked it a little bit harder, but because this was a test panel, I didn't want to blow a lot of energy on it. But you can see that that doesn't look too bad. If you had seen the way it looked when I was doing it, you'd be amazed that it even looks this good. So I thought, well, fine, this is perfect because I still have this decal sheet. So I'm also going to use a couple of these, and we're going to apply some of these decals both to the flat and the gloss surface, and we're going to see if this truly terrible decal does any better over here on the gloss than it does on the flat. So that is my experimental and demonstration plan. So with all that, let's get to it. I'm going to just very quickly, because I'm going to have to let it dry for a while, get one of these yellow decals out here. And I probably should have done this off camera, but this won't take but a second. Okay, there we go. So now what I do is I like to just get a pair of gripper tweezers and grab the decal like that and just drop it here into my little jar. If it's a little tiny decal, and why not? Let's do a little tiny decal just to see how it goes while the water is doing its thing on that. Let me see if I can find a little bitty stencil that I don't mind wasting on this. And the reason I'm going to do a little bitty decal is because small decals, it seems like, tend to be the worst when it comes to silvering and showing the carrier film and that sort of thing. I don't know why that is. I guess it's just because they're, I don't know. But that definitely does seem to be the case. So I'm going to take and chop a little one off of here, and what I'll do a lot of times, if I just have, like say I'm working on a cockpit or something, and I have just a few little bitty decals that I need to apply, then what I'll do is I'll just take the decal and set it there on my bench like that. And then I'll just take a little bit of water on my finger or in a dropper, and I'll just wet the decal in a little puddle of it, just like that. No big deal. Okay, while that's sitting there, all right, And you guys saw how long I let that sit in the decal water. Now, okay, this is a little stiff. Still not sliding off of that paper quite as easily as I want it to. So I'm going to let that go back in the water for a minute. And while that's percolating, let's take this other decal, which I bet is already good to go. And what I do with these little bitty decals like this is I kind of do this two-handed process where I stab it with something that I can pick it up with, and then I just use a hobby knife blade. And okay, I guess, all right, that one's not ready yet either. Okay, got a little ahead of myself, so I'll just dunk that back in the water, get it wet again, and let it sit there. Sometimes you just have to kind of work with it. Okay, now you can see this one is sliding right off of the backing paper now. Okay, no problem. So now you can see that even though this is flat paint, I can move this decal all over the place. Not a big deal, as I would expect it not to be a big deal. So there we go. We'll kind of make this look cool, put it in a good spot. I want it to run over several of these panel lines so that we have to make it melt down into there. Now, once I get it where I want it, what I do is I take a damp Q-tip and I use that. The Q-tip is damp just so it'll make sure to slide over the surface of the decal easily. But what I'm doing is I'm just squeegeeing any air. Whoops, see, it moved on me. Lifted back up. Moving pretty easy for a matte paint surface that allegedly shouldn't allow that decal to slide around, right? I'm just saying. Anyway, the point is that I'm using the Q-tip to squeegee any air or excess moisture out from underneath the thing, so that see, and that's why it's a good idea to have a wet fingertip and a wet Q-tip, because it won't stick and cause it to move around when you don't want it to. It would help if the decal was actually the right size and not hanging off the edge of that wing, right? Anyway, there we go. So that's on there. Now let's go back over here to this other one that wasn't quite ready to come off the paper and do its thing. See, now it's good. And that's the thing about decals, is sometimes you just kind of have to work with them. If they don't do exactly what they're supposed to do right off the bat, then sometimes you just have to give them a little more time and not get panicked or frustrated. So again, my wet Q-tip, and I'm going to just press that one down real firmly and just smash it into place. And again, just make sure that it's as solidly on there as possible. Now, I'm going to go ahead and turn the camera off because you don't really need to see me repeat this process again, but I'm going to do exactly the same thing, but now with this cross. And then we will cut out and try one of these really horrible decals from the Academy sheet. Okay, so let's take a look here. I left the camera on at fast motion so you could kind of see a little bit of what was going on there. A couple of things. You might have noticed how long it took for this decal to come loose from the paper. I had to dunk it several times, and it ended up taking probably a couple of minutes before it actually would slide around easily enough. But there it is. I got it on there. Now you can see that it is, in spite of my efforts to smooth it out, it's got some wrinkles in it, but that's okay. We'll see how that goes. Now, the decal here that came off of the Academy sheet, you might have noticed it just flew off the backing paper and was floating around in the water. I had to go in there and retrieve it with my tweezers. That's the point where some people would panic, but there really isn't any need to. Decals, I mean, they're obviously fragile, but they're still tougher than a lot of people give them credit for. I can't tell you how many times I've run into situations where I ended up having to pick a decal up with tweezers and do something to make it behave. I've even had situations where I had a decal that I put in place, then realized that I had a problem that I needed to correct, like a goober in the paint or the whatever that I was going to have to hit with a little bit of sandpaper before I could put the decal there. I literally had a situation like that on a kit where I had just like a little hair that was caught in the paint that I didn't notice until I got in there to put the decal on. And so I took the decal off immediately while it was still wet, put it in a little puddle of water on the bench, did a little quick sand and polish on the paint to get the hair out, then got the decal out of the puddle of water and put it back on, and everything was fine. I just proceeded as normal. So again, my point is, don't show fear to decals. Just, make them your bitch. Just be careful, be methodical, and work your way through it. Now, you can see that even while I've been talking, that as that cross decal has dried, its wrinkles have smoothed out a lot. So, and you can see the very heavy film on that decal right there. So what I'm going to do now is what I would always do at this point, and that is apply some Solvacet. And I want to take note of the fact that it is 2:44 in the afternoon, okay? Because time is going to be a factor. All right, so just going to take some Solvacet, and I'm going straight for the strong stuff. Got no worries or issues with doing that. And I'm going to start by just applying a thin, uniform layer over the entire surface. But I also want to get it around the edges so that it can wick underneath, at any panel lines or anything like that. And get this little guy right here. And there we go. Now, for little bitty decals, what I'd like to do is just get a nice small brush and use that to apply. And you can see what I was talking about with the silvering. That little bitty triangle has, come on camera, focus up there. The little bitty triangle has a lot of silvering underneath it. You may not be able to see it very well. I don't know, but it's pretty visible with the naked eye. So what I do with little decals like that is just a little bit of Solvacet on a brush. No reason to go crazy. Now you can see that I've got Solvacet running all over the place, but I'm not worried. Because while it might leave a tide mark, that doesn't bother me because I just make it, part of my weathering. But I also know that if it does bother me, that it's going to go away when I put my final clears over all of this. Now, we've obviously just been at this for a minute. while I've been talking, and you can see that the Tamiya decal there, that stripe is already starting to wrinkle up, and so is this other little Tamiya decal here. But the Academy decal, as predicted, is basically doing nothing. It doesn't seem to be affected by the setting agent at all. So what I'm going to do is what you should always do after you apply your setting agent. It's now 2:46, and I'm going to walk away from this. One of the worst mistakes you can make at this point is to start messing with this decal. There are, guys who just can't resist the temptation to take a Q-tip and start trying to smash down all these wrinkles, and the next thing they know, they've torn the decal or smudged it, or they've smudged the paint nearby, or done something that then they have to go back and fix. I can't emphasize enough. There is no reason whatsoever at this point to touch any of these decals. Again, these setting agents are mild solvents. And not only are they softening the decal film and making it very fragile, but they may also be softening the paint or the clear coat that's surrounding the decal, which is not a problem as long as you don't touch anything. If you go rubbing and goofing around with it, and that paint surface has been softened a little bit, then you only have yourself to blame if you screw it up. So again, if there's one thing you take away from this little instructional video, it's that. Once you've applied a setting agent, don't touch it again until you can see that it's dry. So that's what we're going to do. We're going to just let these be and then come back in like half an hour. Okay, so here we are back again, and it is about 45 minutes later than when we left. So let's take a really close look and see where our decals are. I'm going to put my Optivisor on so I can get a good look. Let's see what we got. Okay. I am zoomed in pretty tight, and seems like everything is about as good as I would expect. So, a couple of things. Let me let you guys take a close look now. You can see that the yellow decal has settled fairly well into the panel lines, but not completely. That it's not settled into that one in the middle, but you can see how nicely it's settled there. It's got a little bit of texture to it that you can kind of see, which some of that is it's picking it up from the paint underneath. There you go. You can see didn't settle completely into that line where the leading edge slat is running underneath it, but I wouldn't necessarily expect that, and that's good because we're talking about how to fix that. Now here's the other one with the clear film, and you can see that is completely melted in, and there is zero, I repeat, zero silvering. None, nada, zip, zilch, not even a trace of silvering. Now this is an important thing to point out because I think sometimes people confuse silvering with just the appearance of the film itself. I've seen people talk about their decal having silvered, but in the pictures it's just not visible. So it's two separate things. The film itself obviously has different reflectivity than the paint around it. And that would especially be true if these decals were glossy, like this one is. Okay, that is super reflective. but it's not silvered, except there is a little bit of a bubble right there above the top right corner of the 0. You can see there that angle shows it a little bit better. But I have to say, I'm really surprised that decal went on as well as it did, because I'm telling you, the one on this test piece wasn't even close to like that. I mean, it was absolutely terrible, and I did nothing, and I mean nothing different from what I showed you on camera, even down to the fact that it flew off the decal paper and was floating around in the water. It was exactly the same process, just a different day. So I don't know what to think about that, but when I look at the little bitty decal, okay, that one's interesting because it's melted on there, but it's got some bubbles. So that's not good, but we will talk about how to deal with those. Now, why those bubbles are there is anybody's guess, but basically it's a bubble, so it's trapped air. And it's air that for whatever reason was not able to permeate through the decal film. But anyway, let's talk about what I would be doing next, okay? Because obviously these decals are not completely the way that I would want them to be. So the first thing is, since these did not completely melt into the panel lines here, I'm going to score just real lightly, just enough to cut them. All right, and then we definitely need a cut here where the slats are, because that's just a large gap. I mean, look, the thing about a decal film is that it is not elastic. It's not naturally going to stretch itself over a complex surface. So there's no surprise there. But that's easily fixed. I don't even need to do it on this cross. That's all good. Now what I'm going to do is just come back and hit that again with another application of Solvaset, just right where I need it. There's no point in going over the entire decal again because it's all fine everywhere else. So just going to lay a nice thick bead, and you can see almost immediately that it is wrinkling up right there pretty significantly, which I would expect because it isn't completely cured from being softened by the first application of Solvaset. In my experience, that's like a 4-hour process. You know, every decal is different, and that's one thing that I hope you guys take away from this, is that not all decals are the same. And so spouting rules about how exactly every decal must be done is kind of silly because, again, they're not always the same. Sometimes not even off of the same sheet, as I've seen with this decal right here. Now, how to deal with these bubbles and little bits of silvering. So it's pretty simple. what I'm going to do is just puncture the decal film carefully because it's still a little soft. Right there where the silvering is taking place. Same thing with these bubbles here. Just gonna puncture those. Not a big deal. And then come right back again with some Solvaset only where it needs to be, which, you know, on that little bitty decal is everywhere. No avoiding that. Now, while that's doing its thing, and let's take a look at the other decals. Yep, and you can already see how that one is melting into that deep line, that wide line there where the slats are. Already doing its thing. Bubbling a little bit, but again, that's to be expected. Looks like I need a little more of a relief cut in the corner right there. So, I'm going to let that relax and do its thing. Okay, now, next part of the test is to apply these decals to this piece that's been glossed and see if things go any better. So, there's not going to be much to say while I do that. So I'll turn the camera on fast motion and then we'll come back to it later when they're all dry. Okay, so there we go. You can see basically there were no surprises. I put the decals on. They both came off the paper exactly like the other two did. One came off really quick, the other one took a long time to come loose. And you can see that this one is just resting there. Again, a lot like the other one was. You can see the carrier film. It's a little more difficult to see because it's a glossy surface, but it's there. Same thing with this one, just a little bit wrinkled yet. So what I'm going to do is give these a few minutes to dry and then come back and apply some Solvaset exact same way that I did with the other test piece. One thing to note about this particular test sample is that the aqua gloss I put on here was sprayed about 30 minutes before I started doing the last segment. So at this point, this aqua gloss has been on here for, I don't know, something like an hour and a half or 2 hours. So, you know, generally I would say wait until the next day just to be on the safe side. But hey, it's a test, and I like to push the edges when I do testing like this. So anyway, I think this is about dry and smooth enough at this point that I'm going to go ahead and put Solvaset on it. And then, just like before, we'll come back in a little while and take a look. Okay, so here we are back again, and it is a little over an hour later from the last time we looked at this. And our decals look pretty good. I wouldn't say there's anything going on here that I didn't expect. So you guys can see up close. All right, the cross settled down into the panel lines and rivets perfectly. And you can't see the carrier film as much on this one except when it's when it's at exactly the right angle, but that's mostly because it's on a lighter colored surface than the carrier film on the other wing piece is. You can see, same thing with this decal, it's pretty thick, and it did not settle into the panel lines at all. Not even a little bit, and it has a little bit of a wrinkle on it still. It's just super thick carrier film. But it didn't even settle into those panel lines even a little bit. So I'll continue to tinker with that. This one looks pretty good. Everything looks much better. You can see, you can see a couple of places here. The decal has settled into the panel lines well, but there are a couple of bubbles, either that I didn't notice earlier or that formed. So I've got to deal with those, but those are not a big deal. This one I didn't touch. This one's still fine. I got rid of the little bit of silvering that was there. But you can still see that carrier film a lot. This one, all flattened out nicely after I popped those bubbles. So I'm going to tinker with this a little bit more. I'm going to leave it overnight and then take a look at it again tomorrow. And what I may also do tomorrow is do the trick where we hide that carrier film, even though that's not really part of applying the decal. Okay, so it is a day or two later, and just wanted to show you a couple of things that I did to these two pieces. First, this one, I went ahead and did the trick where I laid down some aqua gloss and around the decal and a little bit on top of it, and then sanded everything flush. And I actually just did that with a brush. And it was, no big deal. Real quick and easy. Put most of it around the decal and then a thin layer over the top of it. Let it dry for a few hours or overnight, whatever, and then come back and flush it down with sandpaper. And I used 1000 grit. I misspoke the other day. I said you could wet sand this. Aqua gloss does not particularly wet sand all that well. It can degrade a little too fast. Plus, even though dry sanding is kind of a pain, it does sometimes work better because it's easier to see the low spots as you work. And that's really what you're concerned with in a situation like this. So the important thing to remember is that decals are just layers of paint. And just like any other layers of paint, you can do a number of things to them. You can sand them. I sanded this decal down just a little bit. It had a little bit of texture in it, so I just knocked that down flat. I could come back and I could do oil paint rendering on these. I could do panel line washes. I could do filters. I could do sponges, whatever I wanted to do, I can do to these decals just the same as I can with any other layer of paint. And that's what I did on this test piece here. You can see where I did a lot of fading and created some tonal variations on this decal right here and a little bit on this one before I put a clear coat on top of them. Now, speaking of clear coats, this piece here, you can see is the one that's got that the decals are applied to the gloss clear. And one thing I hope you'll notice is, if I can get the camera angle right, is right there. You can see some degradation of that aqua gloss as a result of the solvaset resting there on top of it, which is not a big deal because this obviously is going to get a flat coat put on it. And so that should all go away. But, worst case is you do a little bit of sanding and polishing and you'll get rid of that right away. Now, this decal here, no amount of solvaset was getting it to settle down into those panel lines. So what I finally ended up doing was hitting it twice just along the panel lines with pure hardware store lacquer thinner. And it still was not perfectly seated in those panel lines. And what I ended up doing was basically just rescribing them and cutting the decal material away right there where it passed through those panel lines. So, the point to that is that sometimes decals are not going to do exactly what they are supposed to do. And the only way to really avoid that is not use decals at all and just mask and paint, which is what I would do for basically everything that I've done here with decals. But if you are going to use decals, sometimes you just have to accept that they can be weird and you may have to, use some non-standard techniques to get them to look the way that they're supposed to. So anyway, I'm going to go flat coat these real quick. We'll take one more look at them and that'll be the end of the demo. Okay, it's time to wrap this little thing up. And I have just got a couple of quick things to show you. As I said last night, I was going to put a little bit of flat coat on these just to complete the process. And I've done that. And you can see this looks pretty decent. You can see that everything is looking about as good as a decal is going to look. Now, there are a couple of things to notice though. If you turn this in exactly the right direction, and hopefully I'll be able to do it, you will see the film. There it is. You can kind of tell that you can see the film there. There also is still some evidence right there in the lower right corner of that cross of where the solvaset attacked the aqua gloss a little bit. But for the most part, all of that stuff is pretty invisible and not too bad. When I look at it under my optivisor and I hold it in just the right orientation, I can see that film, and I hope you can too, because there it is. This is an important point. It's a little bit easier to see on this one, which is also flat coated. And I just sprayed some Tester's dull coat on them. You can see that the edges of the film on this one are pretty well gone. There's a couple of places when you really get in there tight over on the left side that you can see the edge still a little bit, and a couple of other little defects which I'll talk about in a second. But back to the film. This one is a little bit easier to see the film on. And again, this is just a limitation of decals. Again, going back to what I said about decals just being another layer of paint. The clear film is basically just a little section of clear coat. And because it has a slightly different reflectivity than the surrounding area, it's going to show up differently at the right angle. And you're just not ever going to get around that unless you do like I did here and completely bury it underneath another clear coat and make it all where it's the same elevation. But even then, you can see that what I did here with this number is I ran the clear coat all the way out to the edges of the panel pretty much so that that entire section would look a little bit different, because I knew that even with that clear coat, after I sanded it down and sprayed back over it, it would have a slightly different reflectivity than the area around it, which has a slightly different texture on a really like microscopic scale. And that basically is the same effect as what you're getting here when you see that little bit of clear decal film, even as thin as it is. And that's just the way it's going to be. The only way to avoid that, again, is to either bury it under a clear coat and sand it all down flush, or the best way is just to not use decals at all and actually spray them on. Now, I also want to repeat another important point. I think some guys get confused about what silvering actually is, and they think that just because you can see that film there, that's silvering. That is not silvering. That's just the film showing its different reflectivity. Silvering is when you actually have air trapped underneath the decal for whatever reason. And you can see that when you look at this decal really closely, okay? Look right up there at the upper right-hand corner of the 4. There's a little bit of an air bubble underneath there that I never saw until now. That's silvering, guys. That's what silvering looks like. And sometimes, hey, no matter how hard you work, you're still going to get a little bit of it. There's also a little bit of it, look, right between the 0 and the 2. There's a bubble there that in the right light is pretty easy to see. That's silvering. Another way to see it, I wanted to make sure I could show the difference, so I purposely created a decal with some silvering. I took it out of the water, which was just plain cold water with no vinegar in it, and just very roughly stuck it on here. I didn't try to squeegee the water out of it or really do anything to it. Didn't apply any setting solution, and you can see that is a very badly applied decal. And the clear film shows up a lot because there is air trapped underneath there, in addition to it just being on a rough texture. And part of how you can tell the difference is, look where there's some darker patches in the clear film there on the left side. Those are areas where it's actually properly adhered to the surface. The rest of it, you can see, is not adhered very well, and there are in fact areas where there's clearly air underneath it. That's what silvering looks like. That's the difference. And hopefully you guys can see, based on what I've done here, what you can do with your decal application to make sure that this doesn't happen. Okay, last point. I put a picture of this on SMCG last night, and Matt and Jim were ragging on me about the decals about this German cross decal floating over the panel lines because the resolution of my iPhone wasn't that good, and white, you kind of lose the contrast. So anyway, I'd like to just make sure we get a nice close look at that decal and how well it is settled into all of the panel lines. Now, those guys are just giving me shit, I'm sure, but they made the point that you should never have to score panel lines on a good decal. And I just would say, well, as a generality, that's just not true. Because not all decals are equal and not all panel lines are created equal. And here's a perfect illustration of it. When you look at this cross right here, you can even see how on the left side there, where it crosses the panel line, if I can get a good angle on it, where it really shows up well, you can see over on the left, it's settled into the panel line perfectly. Not as much on the right-hand side. It's settled in there, but not completely. It's hard to tell. On camera, it looks like it's not settled in there at all, but I can tell you I'm looking at it in my optivisor, and it is just not as completely. And you can kind of see that here. Some of these panel lines settled in satisfactorily all by themselves. This one here on the back edge did, but then some of the other ones I wasn't satisfied with, so I went ahead and scored them with a knife and reapplied a little bit of Solvaset. Anyway, the point is, all generalities are false. Do what you got to do to get the best result. That's all that matters. Okay, gangsters, there you have it. That is my exhaustive tutorial on applying decals and a little bit of experimentation thrown in as a bonus. I hope you found it useful for you guys that especially are kind of early in the learning curve and figuring all this stuff out and maybe are intimidated by decals. I hope that this gives you a little more confidence. Decals really are not something you should be afraid of. I mean, look, in model making, there are plenty of things that are way more terrifying. Rescribing panel lines, rigging a World War I biplane, building a Revell kit. I mean, look, just know that decals are like anything. Once you develop a disciplined methodology, then you should be able to proceed with confidence. And obviously there are a few things that you can do along the way to make your life easier. But if there is anything that I hope this video does for all of you who might be watching, including the more experienced guys, I hope it dispels the myth that one of the things you must do is apply a gloss coat before you do your decals. I don't know how much more clearly I could show that it's absolutely not necessary. But I know that there are going to be guys right down here in the comments who are going to say, I've been doing the gloss coat before decals for 50 years and it always works for me and I'm going to keep doing it. Great, by all means, keep doing it. I don't think there's really any harm in it, but there is potential harm. And that's if for no other reason than just statistics. I take the view built over my own lifetime of building things and working on things and mechanicking and that sort of stuff, that the more times you touch a thing, the more opportunities you have to screw it up. And I see way too many posts in Facebook model making groups and message boards and things about people messing up what otherwise would have been a good finish with a clear coat. Now that might have happened anyway, but again, the more clear coats you apply, the more opportunities you have to create a problem. And I think that you could even see with what I did that while there were no advantages to doing the clear coat before the decal, there was one distinct disadvantage, and that was that with aqua gloss anyway, that a strong decal setting solution like Solvaset can sometimes attack it and leave a blemish that may or may not show to any significant degree when you are done. So why risk it when it's not necessary and doesn't provide any benefit? The truth is, I feel like that the clear coat thing prior to decals is just an old wives' tale. Somewhere back in the day, maybe when decals were not as good and there weren't the choices of good setting solutions. I mean, even though Solvaset's been around for 40 years that I know of, maybe at that time somebody had problems with decals on flat paint, and then they didn't have problems with decals on a gloss surface, and so they decided that that surely must be the solution, and it got repeated often enough that it basically became model making dogma. It reminds me of the story that virtually all mechanical engineering materials professors tell about mechanics and guys who look at a piece of broken cast iron and say, well, it broke because it crystallized. Yeah, no. Cast iron already has a crystalline molecular structure, and when it fractures for whatever reason, it breaks along crystal boundaries. But most mechanics are not down there with a electron microscope looking at the actual fracture and the wave front as the crack propagates and all of those things. So they just go with what's basically obvious, and correlation becomes causation. And that happens with all kinds of things in life. And I just really believe that the whole clear coat thing is just one of them. But I don't think that a lot of guys have really tested like I did here with the same decal from the same sheet on both clear coated and not clear coated. So hopefully, anyway, maybe that will put some of that to rest. I doubt it though. But anyway, I still felt like it was worth doing, and I hope you guys felt like it was worth watching. And as always, I definitely appreciate you guys putting up with me. Take care. Much love.